Charles Walker had never been a man who sought attention, never the type to walk into a room expecting the world to part for him, but rather the kind of man whose life had been defined by service, sacrifice, and an unwavering sense of duty, the type of man who carried his scars not as burdens but as reminders of battles fought, brothers lost, and promises kept. Yet on that bright Saturday morning when he made his slow way into the community center of Greenfield, a mid-sized town where modern progress hummed against the background of old prejudices, he felt the eyes of the world on him. Not eyes of respect, but eyes of mockery, suspicion, and dismissal, and though his 70 years weighed heavy on his frame, though his back bent slightly from the wound that had never healed properly after Vietnam, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a soldier who had seen the worst the world had to offer and survived it, his worn cane clicking softly on the polished linoleum floor. His weathered army jacket faded from decades of wear, its patches frayed but still intact, medals pinned with care though they were tarnished with age, each one a story, a memory, a life lived in honor, but to the polished recruiters, the young corporate climbers, and even the other job seekers in sleek suits and crisp dresses, he looked like nothing more than an old man trying to cling to a past that no longer mattered, and so the whispers started almost as soon as he walked in. Faint at first but growing louder as he moved from booth to booth, pausing to read job listings that seemed written for people half his age, whispers like, "What's he doing here? Shouldn't he be at a retirement home?" or, "Look at that old coat. Bet he's just pretending to be a veteran," and a particularly cruel voice, belonging to a recruiter with slicked back hair and an arrogant smirk, carried across the room when he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Hey, old man, the senior bingo hall is across the street, this place is for people looking for real work," and laughter erupted from those who wanted to impress the man with cruelty, but Charles did not flinch, did not scowl, did not lower his gaze, instead he adjusted his cane, lifted his chin, and walked on, because he had faced ridicule before, he had faced worse than ridicule, he had faced nights in the jungle where enemy fire tore through the darkness, where he carried brothers on his back through rivers of blood, where he heard the last breaths of men too young to die, so the laughter of a few arrogant civilians in a warm, safe building was nothing compared to that, and yet the sting of their ignorance pressed against his heart, not for himself, but for the generations who no longer understood what it meant to serve without question, to bleed for a flag that sometimes did not even respect you back, for Charles Walker had been a black man in the military at a time when racism did not stop at the battlefield, when even wearing the uniform did not guarantee dignity at home, when he had returned from Vietnam to be called names on the streets, to be refused service at restaurants, to be treated as if his sacrifice counted for less because of the color of his skin, but still he had served, still he had risen through the ranks to become a sergeant major, still he had led men into battles from which he himself wasn't sure he would return, and he had done it not for recognition, not for praise, but because it was his duty, because honor was not about applause but about action, and though time had taken his youth, though age had lined his face and slowed his step, that same honor lived within him as fiercely as it ever had, but honor was invisible to those who only saw the surface, and so as Charles tried to make his way to a booth where he thought he might ask about a part-time security job, the recruiters behind the table exchanged looks and snickered, one muttering, "Security? He can barely walk," while another chimed in, "Maybe he can guard the coffee machine," and more laughter spread, and Charles felt the weight of their words pressing down like heavy boots, but he would not give them the satisfaction of seeing pain on his face, he would not let them win by reacting, for silence was sometimes the greatest weapon, and he had learned to wield it well, but just as the laughter grew, just as one young woman leaned in with a cruel smirk and said, "Sir, are you lost? You look like you belong in a history book," not here, fate intervened in the way it often did for men like Charles, in sudden, unexpected moments that turned the tide, for the double doors at the far end of the hall swung open with authority, and in walked a man whose very presence shifted the energy of the room, a tall, broad-shouldered figure in full military dress uniform, rows of gleaming medals across his chest, his steps measured, his posture straight as an arrow, and even before he spoke the chatter died, the laughter cut short, and eyes widened with recognition because this was no ordinary man, this was General Raymond Harris, one of the most respected commanders in the United States Army, a man whose reputation was carved into history, a a man who had led thousands and stood before presidents, and as he scanned the room with sharp eyes, his gaze fell on Charles Walker. And what happened next silenced the room in a way no shout or threat could have, because General Harris, the man everyone else deferred to, the man who commanded instant respect, walked with purpose straight to the old veteran who stood quietly near the edge of the booths, and when he reached him, without hesitation, he snapped into a crisp salute, the sound of his boots clicking together echoing in the stunned silence, and in a voice that carried authority and reverence, he said, "Sergeant Major Walker, it is the greatest honor to see you again, sir." And the collective gasp that swept the hall was almost audible, because the very man they had mocked, laughed at, and dismissed was being honored by a general of the United States Army, and Charles, though his hand trembled slightly with age, returned the salute with steady pride, his voice low but filled with dignity as he replied, "It's been a long time, General," and in that exchange the truth unfolded, a truth none of the recruiters or smug onlookers had known. That Charles Walker was not just some old man clinging to the past, he was a war hero, a leader, a man who had once saved the very life of General Harris in the jungles of Vietnam, a story that the general wasted no time in making known as he turned to the stunned crowd and thundered, "You should know who stands before you. This man carried me out of enemy fire when I was bleeding out, when half my unit had been cut down, when all hope seemed lost. He refused to leave me behind. I owe my life to him, and every man who ever served under him will tell you the same. He is the reason they made it home," and silence spread like wildfire, the arrogant recruiter who had mocked him now pale as paper, the young woman who had sneered now staring at her shoes, shame burning on her cheeks, and all the others who had laughed shifting uncomfortably, unable to look at the man they had ridiculed, and General Harris wasn't done, his voice like thunder as he added, "Sergeant Major Walker is a man of honor, a man whose sacrifice and courage you cannot begin to measure. And if there is a single position here that requires leadership, discipline, or loyalty, then it belongs to him, because men like him don't ask for respect. They command it, and you will give it," and in that moment the power dynamic of the entire hall shifted, those who had mocked him now scrambling in their minds for apologies, for excuses, for ways to erase their cruelty, but Charles didn't need their words, for his silence, his dignity, and the respect of his commander spoke louder than anything they could offer. And as General Harris placed a firm hand on his shoulder and guided him toward the front of the hall, Charles allowed himself a small smile, not of triumph, not of vengeance, but of peace, for he knew that his life, his legacy, and his honor had spoken for him, and that no amount of ridicule could ever take away the truth of who he was, and though he would leave that day with job offers he never even asked for, what he truly left behind was a lesson burned into the memory of every person in that hall. That the world may mock what it does not understand, but when truth is revealed, when honor steps into the light, laughter turns to silence, arrogance to shame, and even the proudest are humbled before greatness.